Hi everybody, welcome back to Pride and Prejudice. This is my first time through the book. I am now right at the end of volume 1. This will cover chapters 21 through 23. So, to review a couple of points that I believe to be of importance. Mr. Wickham, the son of Mr. Darcy's father's steward, has accepted a position as an officer in the local militia. Everybody likes him, with the apparent exception of Mr. Darcy, and possibly the Bingleys on Mr. Darcy's behalf. Mr. Bingley has been spending a lot of time with Jane and has promised Mrs. Bennet to come to dinner when he returns from business in London in a few days. Mr. Collins will inherit the house the Bennets live in when Mr. Bennet dies, along with the bulk of Mr. Bennet's fortune, which will probably allow Mr. Collins to retire as he lives there. Right now, he has a job as a pastor on Lady Catherine's estate. Mr. Collins proposed to Elizabeth, but she refused him. So we begin chapter 21. And right here at the beginning, the narrator once again is dogging Mr. Collins, whose, quote, feelings were chiefly expressed, not by embarrassment or dejection or by trying to avoid her, but by stiffness of manner and resentful silence. This seems to imply that the former would be acceptable, or at least understandable, and the latter is less so, though it is unclear why. He starts talking to Charlotte Lucas instead, although somehow, I guess without avoiding Elizabeth? I'm confused. Charlotte listens to him patiently, and everybody is very grateful to her, especially Elizabeth. The next day, the girls go to town, and I'm not sure who all that refers to. Is Charlotte with them? Is it just the younger daughters, or all of them? Well, Elizabeth is there, because Mr. Wickham admits to Elizabeth that it was his decision not to go to the ball at Netherfield. He and another officer walk back to Longbourn with them, and she introduces him, but not the other guy, to her parents. While the officers are there with them, Jane gets a letter from Caroline Bingley at Netherfield. Apparently, everybody there is leaving and is heading to London, and they're not planning to come back. But Caroline has lots of flowery words of affection and expresses hope that they'll get together again in the indeterminate future and asks Jane to write regularly. Elizabeth, however, is skeptical. Jane is bummed because Mr. Bingley won't be coming back, according to this, and more significantly, Caroline expresses hope that when they get to visit Mr. Darcy and his sister Georgiana, that the sister Georgiana and her brother Mr. Bingley will form an attachment leading to, quote, an event which will secure the happiness of so many. So Jane thinks that Caroline believes that her brother Mr. Bingley doesn't have feelings for Jane, and that Caroline Bingley is trying to sort of let Jane down gently. Elizabeth, however, thinks that Caroline thinks that Mr. Bingley is in love with Jane, but Caroline wants Mr. Bingley to marry Georgiana Darcy. Jane, because she trusts everybody, has difficulty believing that Caroline Bingley could be so deceitful, but she's willing to accept that maybe Miss Bingley is just wrong, and Mr. Bingley really does care for her. But then she worries about whether she could marry somebody whose family didn't want her. Elizabeth points out that Jane has to weigh two options. Is it better to be with the man you love and have his family disapprove, or to keep him and his family as comfortable associates, but not be with him? But Jane smiles a little and admits that if Bingley proposed, she, quote, could not hesitate, which is kind of adorable. Bless her smitten little heart. But Elizabeth thinks that Mr. Bingley will return to Netherfield later on, and she's able to convince Jane of this, and that helps Jane feel better. They are very careful to let their mother know only that the rest of the family at Netherfield has left for London. This makes her upset, but probably not as bad as it might have been if they told her everything. Chapter 22. Things start happening really quickly. Within the space of a single paragraph, the Bennets go to have dinner with the Lucases, and Charlotte keeps Mr. Collins's attention and listens to his ongoing prattle. Elizabeth is incredibly grateful and relieved. However, the narrative tells us that Charlotte has her own scheme beyond just making Elizabeth feel better. She wants to get Mr. Collins to propose to her. Let us not forget, folks, that at 27, Charlotte is actually past being a spinster and is now apparently a Thornback. Charlotte's a little nervous because apparently her family is going to be going somewhere else relatively soon, but literally the next morning, Mr. Collins sneaks out of Longbourn and goes over to Lucas Lodge to, direct quote here, throw himself at her feet. He's still smarting a bit from Elizabeth's rejection, and so he's not really sure of himself. But Charlotte sees him walking toward the house, and I love this, quote, instantly set out to meet him accidentally in the lane. He declares his love and proposes in his typical winding and long-winded fashion, and Charlotte accepts him as quickly as she can get the words in. The narrator takes a moment to remind readers that we are not actually supposed to like or approve of Mr. Collins, referring to, quote, the stupidity with which he was favored by nature. It also reinforces that Charlotte, quote, accepted him solely from the pure and disinterested desire of an establishment, not because she actually likes him in the least. Well, Charlotte is relieved, I think understandably, that she no longer has to worry about relying on her siblings' generosity. The narrative, following her perspective at the moment, reflects that marriage, quote, was the only honorable provision for well-educated women of small fortune. It's interesting that she doesn't see becoming a governess as an option. In her mind, a bad husband is preferable to no husband. She's worried about her friendship with Elizabeth, who she knows is idealistic and will disapprove, which, when Charlotte goes and tells Elizabeth, Elizabeth does. Though after Elizabeth's initial outburst, she at least has the basic decency to shut her doggone mouth. Elizabeth simply thinks that Charlotte has, quote, sacrificed every better feeling to worldly advantage. Oh, and that she has, quote, disgraced herself and sunk in her esteem. I have difficulty expressing how much of an insult this is. Charlotte is apparently incapable of deciding for herself what she wants and how best to live her own life. She's not living according to Elizabeth's principles, and therefore, that's bad. That's bad, and it's impossible that she could ever be remotely happy. Chapter 23. They're all full of themselves. Like, all of them. So Charlotte's dad comes over to Longbourn to announce the engagement. He's obsequious and smug. Both Mrs. Bennet and Lydia run their mouths, expressing disbelief. All three of them are not only being unmannerly, but self-centered and unkind. Mrs. Bennet continues to be selfish, surprise, surprise, after Sir Lucas leaves, blaming Elizabeth for all of it and griping at her whenever she sees her for like the next week. Mr. Bennet is snippy and judgy, as are Kitty and Lydia, for different reasons, and Lady Lucas is just as smug as her husband. Elizabeth is a little snit and tries to get Jane to admit that it's a ridiculous match. Jane, of course, simply wishes the couple every happiness because she is the good one. Elizabeth is disappointed in Charlotte for accepting Mr. Collins' proposal, and this hurts their friendship. Lovely. Jane writes back pretty much right away to Caroline, and she and Elizabeth are somewhat stressed because Mr. Bingley has now been gone a whole week and nothing has been heard of when, or now at this point, if he is coming back. Mr. Collins, however, writes to express how much he enjoyed his visit and that he is hoping to visit again soon. None of the family is remotely happy about this, but such is life. Elizabeth has become convinced that Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley's sisters are conspiring to keep Mr. Bingley away from Jane. Jane is obviously upset, but she's not going to talk about it. Their mother, on the other hand, won't stop talking about it, which you would think would be upsetting for Jane. But we must always remember that Jane is the good one. Mr. Collins shows up again in another couple of weeks, and the family doesn't want him to stick around. But it's not so bad because he spends most of his time over at Charlotte's house. Mrs. Bennet is miserable pretty much all the time, but especially so when Charlotte comes to visit them, as she, of course, will be the next lady of the house, which practically drives Mrs. Bennet into fits. And thus we end Volume 1. So I'm finding that I like the most the characters that I think I'm supposed to like the least: Mary, Mr. Collins, and Charlotte Lucas. I don't think I'm supposed to like the Bingley sisters, though, and I'm not particularly fond of them. Well, thanks so much for joining me on my initial expedition through this book. If you are watching this on the day it comes out, feel free to join me tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern for a live discussion of Chapter 8 of Ursula Le Guin's classic science fiction novel, The Dispossessed. The link is below in the description. I hope to see you in the chat. Bye for now, everybody.